great to be with you. Is this working okay? Can you hear me back? I'm not sure. Did you turn it back up?
Yeah. Don't touch it. Okay.
Does that sound any better? Can you hear me in the back now? Okay, good. The first question I have is, are there any Democrats in the House? Only two? Any recovering Republicans in the House? You know, there may be one or two. This morning I was with Congresswoman Kirkpatrick. She had to go to another event, so I'm here instead of her today. But we had a Congress in your corner, and we had three people come up, each one of them who said, you know, I've been a Republican most of my life, but not anymore. I think we're hearing that a lot, right, from people who are, you know, just, they're done. I mean, certainly Republicans and Democrats forever have had differences, big differences, but the gap is widening, and this Republican Party is unlike anything any of us would recognize. I became a student of politics when I was in high school here in Tucson at Rincon High. I actually came from England with my stepfather, who was in the Air Force. I was 15 when I got here, and I just loved the American political system. As soon as I got here, it felt like, oh, it's so much better. And I came from England, which is a parliamentary system, as you know, but I just felt that anybody in the whole world who worked hard and decided to go into politics could actually have an opportunity here, and I still think that's the case. Well, I guess the worst case in point is, you know, the president, right? Who would have thought? But the first political figure I saw, and you will remember in 1960, right, was the race for the presidential nomination in our party between Lyndon Johnson and John F. Kennedy. And I was just totally fascinated by this, because you don't have anything like that in England, right? In fact, you have such a class system, at least in those days, and to some extent still, that, you know, the Republican, the Conservative Party, typically, you got to be some kind of an aristocratic background or public, you know, good schools and all of that, and the Labor Party was of a different persuasion. So coming here and seeing that battle was really fascinating, but I fell in love with John Kennedy at that time as a young man. And one of my prized possessions, which I got from Gabby actually, as a poster on my wall in my office of his inaugural address. And if you ever want to see the difference between a real president and what we have, look at those two different addresses, right? I mean, Kennedy was full of hope and aspiration and vision about the world and the country, and the rest you know on the other side. Well, I'm here today to talk about two things, well, probably more than two in the end, but the first one is Rosemont. I want to bring you up to speed on the Rosemont Mine situation, and I'm glad to say I can bring some good news today. Maybe if we'd done this a month and a half ago, not so much, but now for sure, some good news. And then secondly, I want to just highlight some of the more important positions and votes and activities that Congresswoman Kirkpatrick has taken since she's been in office since January of this year in CD2. And of course, time for questions, and I'll be happy to stay and mingle a little bit afterwards if you guys have one-on-one questions. I would say this, before we get to that part, one of the most important things that we do in a district office, and this is my second rodeo, really, one with Gabby and now with Ann, is provide constituent services. I'm going to leave these flyers. I don't have probably enough for everybody, but it tells you the kinds of issues that we work on behalf of people who come to us. Obviously, it has nothing to do with partisan politics. It has everything to do with helping people who have issues with federal agencies. And the biggest caseload we have is veterans. About 40% of our caseload are people who have served in the military, and we're just proud to be able to do that. You know, we have about 75,000 veterans in Congressional District 2. It's one of the largest groups of veterans in the whole country. Well, with good reason. You know, we have 2 military installations, one in Fort Huachuca and the other in Tucson doing this month, and so people tend to want to retire. Once they've found the Southwest, like most of them, they fall in love with it and they want to stay. So we are very, very focused on veteran services. So much of what we do is trying to expedite veterans' benefits, both financial as well as medical benefits, getting a higher level of disability so they can get better benefits, dealing a lot with Vietnam era veterans, of course, and they've been, in many ways, the most mistreated veterans group in our history. We may not have liked the war, and I certainly was very strongly against it as a college student at U of A, president of the Young Democrats at the time, right in 1965 to 67, and that was at the height of the protests against the war. But regardless of what we think about the war, we got to make sure that the veterans who come home are well treated, and that was not the case for Vietnam vets. Many of them ended up homeless in our communities. And now we have a whole new crop of younger veterans, obviously, out of Iraq and Afghanistan, and they have two signature wounds of those wars that are unlike the wars that America's been in forever. Those two are, one, traumatic brain injury, and two, post-traumatic stress disorder, sometimes both. The body armor usually saves lives, but it doesn't help if you're rattled around in a Humvee because you have a bomb that went off beside your vehicle. Your head rattles around in there, in your helmet, and that's when you get TBI, traumatic brain injury. And post-traumatic stress disorder, it's very, very real for about 500,000 veterans of those two wars. When I was in Congress, I went to Afghanistan on a congressional delegation, a tour visit, and I saw firsthand why PTSD is so prominent in that war and the war in Iraq. Everywhere you turn, you're looking over your shoulder to make sure there's nobody out to get you. When I went to got off the plane, they rushed us from the airport in Kabul to the American Embassy, which is like a fortress really, because the dangers are so intense. And so those men and women coming home, they need our help, they need our support, and we're just not ready. The Veterans Administration is just not ready for that level of the numbers and the kind of intensity of need that they have. So I went on a little bit about that because I feel so passionately about the veterans and serving them and supporting them, regardless of our attitude or position on the wars. And I wanted to make sure you knew that if you have a veteran in your family or know a veteran here in the area and they need help from our office, these flyers will tell you how to get to us. The second largest group that we serve in the Constituent Services Office are seniors, older Americans who are having difficulty with Social Security, sometimes with Medicare. And you know, we help people navigate this morass called the federal government, all the agencies and, that you have to deal with. And our job is to break through the walls and barriers to getting services and supports. As of last week, we have been able to recover just under $1 million of benefits for both seniors and for veterans that they otherwise didn't have or couldn't get. Sometimes they're back payments, sometimes it's just getting people payment for the first time, straightening out Social Security problems. So I want to make sure at the outset that you know how important constituent services is to us, and I hope that you'll encourage friends, neighbors, perhaps yourselves if you have an issue, to come see us. The other issue or a service that we provide that most people don't know about is helping with visa issues, and helping with passport issues. And I just last week got a call from a constituent who lost her passport. And she said, what am I going to do? I'm leaving for Europe in a week and a half or two. I said, we are very lucky here in Pima County, you may not know that we have one of only 2 passport centers in the entire country. Meaning that, and it has to be an emergency situation like hers, right? You can go, there's two pieces to this. You go and you make your application, and you bring your photographs and all of that, and then in a separate building with a private contractor in a, like Fort Knox building, they actually make the passports on site. And so in this case, Chris, who called me desperate, God, what am I going to do? I said, let's set you up at an appointment at the passport center. She went in at 11 o'clock that morning. She had her passport in her hand at 4 o'clock that afternoon. She went off on her plane the next day. That's the kind of service that we can get here, but it has to be an emergency. It can't be just a regular passport request. It's gotta be something where you're needing to leave, you got a death in the family, you gotta travel or whatever overseas, or you're going on a vacation and something happened to your passport, stolen, lost, whatever. You forgot to renew it, something like that. We can help. Those are the array of services that we are more than happy to provide. So I hope you'll make sure you use our offices. Okay, let me shift to the main reason I'm here today, which is to talk about the Rosemont Mine. My history with the Rosemont Mine goes back to when I was Gabby's district director. Actually, it goes back to the campaign before I was her district director, when I was her outreach director. In early 2006, she asked me to do that job, which was to reach out to various organizations. I was the prime person for our unions in Tucson and in Congressional District 2 because of my strong union background. I was a union member for almost 40 years in my two different careers. So I worked on that, but I also worked on policy issues for her, and she wanted a series of roundtables that would bring her up to speed on issues that for the whole district. And one of the first policy roundtables we had was about this thing that we had never heard of before, called the proposed Rosemont Mine. This was early 2006, probably February or March. And because Gabby wanted to hear different points of view, we had a meeting with the guy who represented the Rosemont Mine with a company called Augusta out of Canada. And we met separately with a group called the Save the Scenic Santa Ritas, which I know many of you are aware of. We met with them separately because we knew there wasn't going to be a similar view at all at the table. We heard both of their presentations. I have to tell you, the guy from Augusta was the most arrogant person I think I've ever met. He came with an attitude like, we got this. And you got the feeling that he thought we were a bunch of hicks out here, that he was just going to roll right over us and build that mine. Well, his attitude, I think, was seen for many, many months and years afterwards as they went through the process. The Save the Scenic Santa Ritas came in, and their arguments were absolutely compelling. I'm sure most of you know why we don't want this mine, and I don't know how many of you feel that way, but certainly Gabby felt that way. When I was in Congress, I took that same position, and Ann has taken that position as well, Ann Kirkpatrick. So we have consistent, except for that 4-year period in between, right? Between when I lost my race to Martha McSally and when Ann became the representative last November, representative-elect. So the issues are abundant, right? I mean, I have tended to focus, as have Ann and Gabby, on the water issue, which I think is the most compelling problem that this mine presents. But the other issues are so very important. For example, wildlife corridors will be disrupted. We have sightings of the jaguar, as you know, but beyond that, in the Santa Rita Mountains, particularly in those foothills, you have a lot of animals, and that's where they cross to go get water and food. You have native land that is sacred land to the Teal Nation, to Another Nation, to the Hopis, who used to have a presence here back in another time, and the Pasquayaki. And they all have sacred land and burial sites in the area where Rosemont is proposed. And they're concerned, as they would be, of course, about disrupting grave sites, artifacts, and all the rest. But the pollution that will come from this mine is another matter. Water pollution, air pollution, over 100 ore trucks on that scenic highway every single day. How many of you traveled the highway to Sonoyta, Patagonia? You know how beautiful it is, right? It's also can be real tricky because you got all those curves, and quite a few accidents unfortunately happen there, but it's a beautiful scenic highway. Now take what you experienced driving down that highway and imagine 100 ore trucks coming and going as you're trying to get to the wine country or whatever. And it's not a pretty picture. We also know that the economic impact is negative, even though those who tout Rosemont as a great job creator. There was an economic study commissioned by Save the Scenic Santa Ritas a few years back that showed that the economy of the area would be hurt, not helped. Why? Because ecotourism is a very big deal in that part of our state. And people come to bird watch, they come to walk and hike to camp, to be down there for the wine tour and all 14 wineries that are in that area. A lot of people come there because of the beauty of the Santa Ritas. And can you imagine how many people will not come when they see a 1 mile wide, half a mile deep, big hole in the base of the Santa Rita Mountains and all the other stuff that's going on? So the reasons to oppose this mine are numerous. And it didn't take any convincing at all when Ann decided to run for this position here to have her on board. She saw it for what it was. So that's some of the early history. Now, I want to explain a little bit about why the company that started this, and the company that currently owns the land for the mine, how their behavior influenced how people felt about the mine. Apart from the arrogance that the gentleman from Augusta displayed when he met with Gabby and me, we also have some history early on of how Augusta treated this community. The first public meeting that the Forest Service held on the Rosemont Mine was an open meeting. Anyone in the community could come. They had a series of those over the next year or two. The first one, though, all of these former miners and steel workers started showing up. They were showing up in big buses. They were showing up after having been treated to dinner. How'd they get there? The Rosemont Company brought them to that meeting, promising that they would get a job if they supported the mine. And they were totally taken advantage of. They were furious. They were absolutely pissed off, to be quite frank. And they raised hell once they got there and realized what was going on, that they were being scammed by this company. And we took on that issue with the Forest Service, and they did go after Rosemont and kind of backed them off. So it's an early history that was ugly and difficult and disrespectful of our community and our wishes down here. Then a few years later, and this was something everyone expected, quite frankly, Augusta sold the rights to the mine to another Canadian company called Hudbay. And when they came in, I was still in office at the time in 2013 or 14, I can't remember which year, but they had a totally different approach. They were so diplomatic, and the guy who was the vice president of their company was so charming, and he brought his kids and his family to the area, and he was living here, and it was just like, oh, it's so different. But in the end, the same goal. To dig a big hole in the basin of Santa Rita's. Nothing had changed. So the Forest Service, acting under the auspices of the 1872 mining law, 1870, not 1972, 1872 mining law. Ulysses S. Grant was the President of the United States. And why did we have the 1872 mining law? Because we wanted to open the West. And the national government was all about that. And it said, quite frankly, that if you want to have a mine on public land, you can have a mine on public land. If you want to use it for tailings and waste materials, you can have a mine there. Or you can actually mine into public land. And from 1872 until just about 2 months ago, that law has allowed mines to be put into some of the most beautiful areas in our country. And it was about to do it here too. So there's many tracks that a mine must go through down in order to get permission to mine. The most significant is the process that the Forest Service, in this case, conducts, which is a several years actually process where they collect information. They got something like 45,000 comments from the public during that time. And the mining company is required to provide the Forest Service with what they call mitigation plans. In other words, if we mess up this land or this water, this is how we're going to fix it. So that was one process. And we knew that at the end of that process, there was a second process that was probably more likely to be beneficial to those of us who opposed the mine. And that was under the Clean Water Act, which is by comparison, a fairly recent piece of legislation, and it requires if you're going to be disturbing waters, creeks or rivers or what have you, or aquifers, you have to get a permit under the Clean Water Act, a 404 permit. But anyway, Forest Service charged along, and to no one's surprise, they approved the mine plan of operation, and now we are waiting for the Clean Water Act study to be done. And as I said, most of us, I suppose, in working against this mine, knew that that was really our last chance to get opposition support from governmental agencies. We met with the regional or the Arizona Army Corps of Engineers scientists, because the Army Corps of Engineers is the entity of federal government that gives the 404 permits under the Clean Water Act. And so the woman who was here, Marjorie Blaine, was a straight-ahead scientist, was not looking at partisan issues, was looking at the science of this request for a permit. And she determined that the company did not deserve to get a permit. And she wrote a very scientific study to support it, how the mine would impact negatively on the waters of the area. Great, we thought, this is a step in the right direction. It went to Los Angeles, where her supervisor is officed, a colonel in the Army Corps of Engineers. And she studied the presentation, and she agreed with it. So, okay, step 2, we're good in progress. Then it went to the regional office in San Francisco. There's a general under the Army Corps who was there. And in 2017, 2016 actually, he approved the denial of the 401 permit. Great. Well, then came the election of 2016. And we all know who got elected, right? And by 2017, the Army Corps General was beginning to have second thoughts about the permit. Certainly nothing to do with politics, right? And so he actually then denied the permit. He actually waited until 2019 to deny it and to uphold it, rather, to give the permit. And so here we are. We've got the Forest Service agreeing. We've got the Army Corps at the highest level, regionally agreeing. And we actually had the Environmental Protection Agency, who had opposed the mine based upon the 404 permit, also going along with it. And this was back in about February, March of this year. Okay, what did we do? Well, fortunately, there were some lawsuits that were already in process. There were actually 3 different lawsuits that have been filed against the Rosemont Mine. One by the 3 tribal communities, the Teo Nation, the Pasquayaki, and the Hopi Nations. Another by the Save the Scenic Santa Rita's group, and a third by the Center for Biological Diversity. And they wended their way through the system, and they got to a judge here in Arizona, in Tucson, at the federal court. His name is Soto, Judge Soto. And lo and behold, he said that the Rosemont mine could not proceed because the Forest Service had misinterpreted the 1872 mining law to give them the okay. No one ever expected this, quite frankly, because the 1872 mining law has been held sacred for so long, and every Forest Service review has said across the country, we have no choice. We have to give this mine the okay because the law says so. But here comes a federal judge saying, wait a minute. And it's kind of a technical argument that he made, but one that I think is very compelling. And it's a little bit in the weeds, but let me tell you what it is, because it really, hopefully, is the way that this mine will ultimately be stopped. What the Hudbay mining plan of operations said is that they would dig the mine on private land. No problem, they can do whatever the heck they want, actually. They do have to get some permitting. But they wanted to dump the rock, the waste rock, and the tailings on about 2,000 acres of forest land right next door to their land. And that's what the Forest Service had approved. Judge Soto said, however, that was a bad interpretation by the Forest Service because while the mining company held patents to the land immediately below the Forest Service, it wasn't planning on mining there. And why could he determine that they weren't going to mine there? Because they were going to put 700 million tons of waste on the land and another 200 million of rocks. So if they thought there was a patent underneath there that contained minerals that they could mine, they would never be dumping the waste. So in some ways they were caught in their own plan. And he said, unless you're planning on mining or you have rich mineral supplies underneath the public land, you can't use the public land to dump your waste. Therefore, the Forest Service was wrong in making that interpretation that they could, and that started the ball rolling. So immediately the Forest Service, after that ruling, withdrew their approval. Then, so did the Army Corps remove the permit for the 401 permit. And it's a decision that's been called blockbuster by people who are on both sides of the issue. Attorneys who say they've never expected this, and it has implications if it survives legal challenges to change how mining is done in this country and how it can or cannot use our land either for the mining operation or for dumping the waste. I can't tell you, when I saw this decision, I was floored. I never expected it. I think most people didn't either. And so now we're in a position where the only recourse left for the company is to appeal, and they will. The next place, if they don't go back to the judge and ask him to reverse his ruling, which they may do, but the next step is the Ninth Circuit in San Francisco, and it is a pretty progressive court, as you may know, historically, and we hope and believe that there's a chance of it upholding Judge Soto's decision. Where do you go after that? You go to the Supreme Court. Not so good, right? But here's what I think is going to happen. It's going to take about 2 years before we get to the end of that legal process. Hopefully, we'll have a new president, different president, right? We'll have a different EPA secretary. We'll have a different person in charge of the Army Corps, in charge of all of these agencies that kind of went along, who are now dealing, well, hopefully if there's not a legal ruling to reverse what Soto did, we will be dealing with a whole new ballgame. And one of the things that the mining industry is beginning to think about is how can they get Congress to clarify the interpretation of the 1872 mining law so that they can actually have some certainty when they're looking to build a mine. One of the things that they want is if we get a permit, or if we get a patent rather, can we actually mine here? And you have to make sure that you've got some regulations that support the ability. So anyway, all of us are, very happy with the outcome of Judge Soto's ruling. We're thrilled that someone took a stand, finally. Lawyers who are both lawyers for the industry and lawyers who are opposed to the mines being done anywhere on public land, they're generally agreeing that Soto has a point, and that the Forest Service itself was mistaken or misinterpreted the law. And it's interesting, if you've been following this in the paper, and I tell you that one of the best series on the Rosemont mine is done by a local environmental reporter by the name of Tony Davis. He works for the Star. I mean, he's old school investigative reporter. You expect to see him with his trilby hat and the press sticker on it, He's something else, and his articles are brilliant. I mean, he tries as best he can to be objective, but he reports it like it is, and he has the best series of articles on the evolution of this mine over the course of now almost, 13 years. It's a long time to be holding back. And the mining company feels that they've gone through it all and they should be able to build, but not anymore, not until this is resolved. So that's where we are. You know, we fortunately have the House of Representatives in Democratic hands. And why is that important to this mine? Not only because the woman I work for and her colleagues can actually make laws, even though the Senate kind of ignores them, but we can block things, at least try to block things. But even more importantly than that, on this issue, we have the chairman of the House Natural Resources Committee from Southern Arizona, Representative Grijalva. And he and Congresswoman Kirkpatrick have been working very closely together on this issue. The mine is in Kirkpatrick's district, but the issue is for all of us in Southern Arizona, in the whole state, I think, for that matter. So I've talked to Congressman Grijalva, and Ann and I have talked with him together. One of the things he wants to do is have a field hearing, meaning that you not have a hearing in DC, but you have a hearing out here where people who are affected by these proposals live. And he's going to hold some people's feet to the fire because they need to be. You may, if you read the article about Judge Soto's decision, you may have also read a follow-up article by Tony Davis where the superintendent of the Forest Service in Southern Arizona, Janine Derby, who I worked with when I worked for Gavi, she was in charge of the Forest Service process and decision, and she came out after Soto's ruling and said, guess what? I was called to Albuquerque, where the regional headquarters are, and I was told to stop asking tough questions about whether this mine should be approved. And she got in line. And now she regrets it. Of course, she may have regretted it then, for all I know, but now she came out basically as a whistleblower after the fact that, yes, she was told that she had to go along with what the 1872 mining law said. Don't be tweaking it, don't be trying to misinterpret it. So we have that they were told by the regional director in Albuquerque to get in line. We have Soto's ruling. We have the back and forth in the Army Corps of Engineers, and I want to just kind of finish my remarks with this a little bit. There's been a lot of shenanigans around this mine in the federal government. I think the most egregious, quite frankly, is what the Army Corps went through. The Army Corps, as I said, at two levels, here in Tucson, in LA, said this mine should not get a permit. Very well-based scientific recommendation. The general in charge of this in San Francisco agreed with his subordinates and issued a letter to everyone who wanted to see it that the 404 permit would not be allowed. And then after the election of the current inhabitant of the White House, he changed his mind. And that's another aspect of the investigation that Congressman Grijalva and Congresswoman Kirkpatrick want to conduct. They met with him before he issued his decision, and then he did it about a week later. So there's a lot more to come. Legal moves, of course, congressional moves, hopefully a new Senate that's more friendly to what the House does, and a new inhabitant of the White House a year and a half from now. And as we know, things change when you have new people in office, and we're hoping for that. So I come with a message of hope about this. I really believe that we're at a point now where this mine can be stopped. A lot of what we said before was sort of speculative and hopeful and optimistic and idealistic against some great odds. But I think you can see, given the progress of this whole discussion, that things have changed dramatically, thanks to Judge Soto. And one final comment about the Army Corps. When the general in San Francisco, who reversed field and approved the permit, was going to be reassigned to another region of the country. He was going to be up in Portland to cover that part of the country. He requested, and he was granted, to take the Rosemont Mine decision with him to Portland. And to us, that's very suspicious, right? Why does he want to hold on to it, and why was he given permission to hold on to it when he's not even going to be close to the region that it's in. So we see a lot of backroom stuff going on here, and that will be brought out, I think, in the hearings that Congressman Grijalva will hold, and it will be brought out by people like Tony Davis. So that's a lot of it in the weeds. I apologize. Nobody's dotted out yet, so I'm good on that, I think. So, because I know you're interested in this topic, but I want to pause now before I talk about some other stuff and take any questions you have about Rosemont. Okay?
Yeah, let me get this going.
Yes, sir.
My name is Phil Nicolai. Thank you for your update. We really appreciate it. I have 3 quick questions. Maybe not quick.
Phil, do you want to use this?
Sure. I have 3 quick questions. One is regarding why has no one proposed legislation to update the 1872 Mining Act? That would go a long ways to possibly correcting the problem in the future. Question 1. 2, does the revised regulations that the President is pushing forward as we speak have any impact on what's going on with the Rosemont Mine? That's 2. And 3, are you in any way familiar with the status of the pollution that we have just north of us all along the highway, where they have all the wells that are pumping water back into the mine to try and keep it from going into our aquifer? Thank you.
You bet. Well, first question, yes, there have been attempts. In fact, when Gabby was in office and when I was in office, there was legislation introduced in the House to significantly revise and update the 1872 mining law. They didn't get passed, but there were attempts to do that, and I think it's a function of you have to control the House, the Senate, and the White House, quite frankly, before you'll have a chance of really doing that, because it's a pretty big deal. The mining, we can talk about lobbyists for the rest of the night, but the mining industry, needless to say, and all of the people associated with them, the different industries that they help support financially, they came out in force, and that was part of the problem with getting the changes. The second, I remember the third question, and I'll go to that and then come back and ask you to clarify. The third has to do with what the current administration is doing to our environmental laws. It doesn't have a direct impact on Rosemont, given the judge's decision, but the attitude and the political posture within the White House and the people that the president appoints to be in charge of these agencies, that's the real problem. Because as I'm sure you all noticed, that virtually every secretary of every cabinet office is someone who is opposed to that department. Exactly. You know, you got the fox in the hen house, and as long as that's the case, who knows what they might try to do? I mean, they may try to intervene some way administratively on Rosemont. I don't think they could just blow off the decision of the judge, although Trump doesn't have much respect for the legal system. So I don't think what they're doing now, even though it's dreadful, will have a direct impact one way or the other on Rosemont. And the second question, I forgot what it was.
The second question had to do with the pollution that we currently are experiencing out of the existing mine that's just north of the Green Valley.
The Sarco, no, not Sarco, it's Santa Rita, yeah. You know, I'm familiar a little bit with the plume issue. We've got them not just here, we've also got them in Tucson. I was just talking on Thursday with the government relations person for the Tucson water, and we've got problems with contamination of the wells in the Tucson area from Davis-Monthan, Tucson International Airport, and the Air National Guard. When they've been conducting their firefighting training, they've been putting contaminants into the wells, into the groundwater system, and that's affecting potentially a lot of mines there. As far as what's happening here, there are 2 issues really. One related to Rosemont and the other related to the problem of the existing mine. I'll deal with the one related to Rosemont first. What the Rosemont people, both Hut Bay and previously Augusta, have said when we raise the water issue, you're gonna take water out of the Green Valley Santa Rita aquifer, which is already somewhat depleted, and you're gonna pipe that water over the mountains to the mine. Aren't you gonna harm these communities, both in terms of development for people who wanna live here, as well as businesses? And they say, no, we're putting water back. Well, they're putting water into Marana because they have bought rights historically from Indian communities, and they are actually replenishing the aquifer under Marana, and they're trying to say, mine is, oh, well, we're putting water back into the aquifer. Well, you know how far it is between here and Marana, right? I doubt very much if those aquifers are feeding here. As far as what's happening with the existing mine, I guess I need a little bit more information about the extent of the plume, but we do know that anytime you have a mine or a base, the potential for polluting the groundwater is very real. And we really have to make sure that wells are shut down when that's happening, and action is taken to remove the toxins. So I'd like to know more maybe after the meeting, so I can get up to speed on what's happening here, so we can look at what might be done or what is already being done. We make some inquiries about that. But I do know this, that you can, in fact, clean the water to remove contaminants. If you're concerned about plume, the expansion of plume, water plumes, you can shut down wells so you can stop it from polluting the water supply. So there are things that can be done. The county and the city, I think, working together on this maybe have an issue. But could we meet afterwards and I'll get more information so I can get a better answer to you about that specific issue?
The side issue is when this mine shuts down, right now they're pumping the polluted water back into the mine. When this mine shuts down, what's going to happen then? There's nobody there to pay for the circulation.
What we'd have to do is see what kind of mitigation plan they have, but you know these companies make all kinds of promises, right? And sometimes they are bonded to fulfill their promises. So it's something we need to really look into, because I'm not as up to speed on this one as I should be, and I will be after we talk, I'm sure, and then we'll look into it, okay? Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you for your fine presentation today. Two items that are not specific to Rosemont, but related to it. Number one, it seems to me that there is a larger policy issue over the long term that relates to the development of the West. The 1872 Mining Act, of course, is only one piece of legislation enacted in the latter part of the 19th century and early 20th century. You had other acts like the reclamation laws, for example, the Taylor Grazing Act, and a number of others. The point is, that series, that whole set of legislation was oriented toward developing the West. The West is developed. Now what do we do? Seems to me there's a large policy issue that needs to be addressed there, number one. Number two, just down the road in Patagonia, I understand that there is an Australian mining group that is actively developing mines in that area, using some of the same roads that you referenced. Would you speak to both of those?
Sure. Well, you're absolutely right that these laws, that some of them go back a century or more, were enacted so that people would be encouraged to come out west. The Homestead Act and all that, so that people could, well, they come here, they plant themselves here, they get land, and they can build a house, and they can ranch or farm or whatever. You can mine. Even Arizona's laws, water laws, favor two industries. One is mining, and the other is ag. And so, for example, here nearby, as you know, we've got the pecan orchards, and they suck up a lot of water. But they have one of the first claims, along with mining, to water supply. And even though we're in the middle of a drought condition in Arizona, and the CAP water, Colorado River Project water, is just gonna be drying up. We're not gonna have enough to even satisfy the allocations that cities and counties across the West have. So, I mean, there are issues beyond the national laws. We've got state laws and regional agreements, such as the one that produced what is called the Drought Contingency Plan that was passed by Congress just about 2 or 3 months ago, which had to do with the impending problem with enough water supply from the CAP to satisfy the needs that people have already been expecting to get satisfied. And so people are gonna lose their allocations. So to go back to Rosemont for a moment, if they think they're gonna get CAP water down here to give them the water they need for the mine, fat chance, because it's just not gonna be there. But your point, sir, is well taken. There are so many things that we have historically on the books that had to do with a whole different era. You're absolutely right, the West is developed. The West is obviously a lot of public land, and this is where this administration is trying to make some inroads. They want to open it up to all kinds of speculative activity, including development. So, obviously, elections have consequences, and we've got probably the worst attack on the environment going on since I can remember. Until we had a guy under, was it Bush 1? I'm trying to remember his name now. It's been a long time. Department of Interior. It was just dreadful. I mean, he got ousted, but this is the worst, and we've got to make sure that the laws that these men and women are using to justify some of their actions have to be seriously changed. The only way we're going to get to your question of how do we revise or change these laws is when we have the House, the Senate, and the White House in the hands of people who have a different attitude about the environment, the water of our communities, and the West, which is impacted heavily. And I believe we're on the way to doing that. You know, we have a big election, as you well know, in Arizona. Can you imagine if you told somebody, a friend of yours back east, that Arizona might be in the process of having 2 Democratic senators, and they'd say, okay, yeah, what have you been smoking? And they would wonder. But I think we could well see that November of 2020. So it's going to take that kind of, those kinds of people in those offices, in the Senate changing the majority, and keeping the majority in the House, and changing who's in the White House, before we can get to those issues. You had a second question on beginning to
Going to mining.
Yes. When I first ran in the special election in 2012, that was part of my district, because we had a lot of Santa Cruz County at Tubac, and then we had Sonoita and Patagonia. So I've worked with the mayor and council of Patagonia during that time. This is long before, this is 2013, 14, long before the mining activity actually engaged. And they're really concerned, as they should be, about what's going to happen to their water, what's going to happen to their community, which is a idyllic community. If you've never been to Patagonia, I encourage you to go and check it out. It's just wonderful, as is Sonoita. And they're concerned, as are all of us, about Rosemont, what's going to happen if those mines open up. And there's a different set of circumstances there, and that's just part of the problem that they have, we all have. The public land issue is not an issue for those mines, as I understand it. Those patents are on private land, so they can do a lot, but they still have to have mining plan of operations, and the pollution and water pollution and the air pollution and the road impact is still going to be there. So, you know, we're not engaged with that issue, unfortunately, right now, because we don't have that district, but Congressman Grijalva does. And if anything we can do, is there anything we can do to help support the community of Patagonia, we will do it. And I would imagine that, and we'll find out more when I talk to his staff, that Congressman Grijalva is doing what he can to minimize the impact if he can eliminate it. But again, I think we have a different set of circumstances. Private land, you can drill and you can mine and you can haul off the waste, I suppose, because aren't those silver and gold mines? They're not copper, I believe.
And lead, I think.
Yeah. So the impact in terms of size is not necessarily going to be the same thing, but the disruption to that beautiful community is going to be significant. So we have to do what we can to help that community through this tough period. And unfortunately, I think their situation is a little bit more dire than what we've ended up with at Rosemont. Yes, ma'am.
Oh, that disastrous Secretary of the Interior, it was James Watt.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah.
You know, well, great memory. Thank you for that. He was awful. You know, and now he was the awfulest in the whole cabinet, as I recall. It was Reagan. It wasn't Bush. It was Reagan, right? I think so. And now it's a cast of villains, right? I mean, if you look at who's in charge of all of the federal agencies, every single one of them is headed up by someone who doesn't like the agency, doesn't want it. In fact, you know, the former governor of Texas, remember what he said to me running for president? He wanted to eliminate 3 departments. And he only remembered 2. But the one that he actually forgot, as I recall, was the one he's now the secretary for, right? So it goes. So we do need to change the White House so that we can change who's in charge of those agencies. And it rolls down from there. I mean, what this president is doing, in addition to appointing what I call a cast of villains, and people who hate the agencies that they've been given responsibility for, he's allowed vacancies in virtually every federal agency to go unfilled. And it's those people, you know, 2 or 3 layers down from the secretary who really do the grunt work to get the secretary has to listen to what the real issues are. And you even see it, you know, when he decides that the Weather Service is wrong, right? And he orders people to change the scientific decision. So we're in, what is that book, the lead paragraph, it's the best of times or the worst of times? Well, I'm not so sure about the best of times. I think it really is the worst of worst times, and we have to just make a big effort, as you said, to get turnout high next year. It really comes down to what we can do to turn out voters. Now, I'm sort of preaching to the choir here, because this community votes about 95% or 90%. It's the millennials that we've got to get out to vote. It's the people of color who, and for many years have been disenfranchised and still are in many states to vote. And it's that group, the people who are most affected by this administration are those who don't show up. And we've got to do what we can to get them there. Questions, other questions? Yes, sir.
This is more of a comment.
I'm going to use this
we
with
might-
recording, so we need.
We might have some control over the House and the Senate and the presidency. What we don't have control over, though, is the Supreme Court.
Oh my God, yes.
And once these issues go from one court to the other court, to a higher court, to a higher court, and end up in the Supreme Court, I mean, that could be disastrous.
Of course. That is a fear that we all have, I think, and share. Here's my optimistic view of that. I'm always trying to find a light in the tunnel, you know. First of all, RBG cannot die. Right? If we have to put her on life supports to get her in, we'll do it. I think what Stephen Colbert said, we ought to wrap her in bubble wrap to make sure that if she falls, she bounces. What an amazing woman. I've never had the good fortune to meet her. I've seen her on the floor of the House when the State of the Union comes. It's so funny, the last time I was there and saw that, I was really just fascinated by her. She's an amazing person, but I was watching her and she was doing this. Totally zoned out. The Z's were coming out of her mouth, you know? And so she was asked later, how is it that you fell asleep? Did you fall asleep in the president's speech, and why? She said, yes, I did. And I think it was Justice Sotomayor and I had a few glasses of wine before we came to the State of the Union. I mean, she's classic. I mean, you know, if you probably, maybe, I'm a big fan of Stephen Colbert. It gives me some lift at the end of a terrible day. And he did the Ruth Bader Ginsburg workout. I don't know if you saw that. He could not keep up with this woman. So, you know, that's one thing. She cannot die. I'm sorry. You can't go on. And you have to be here at least until 2021, when we hopefully will have a new president. And then the other thing that gives me some optimism is that we've got at least one justice who has been talking about resigning, retiring, if you will, because he's been there a long time, and that's Clarence Thomas. Right? I mean, we all know that story, but here's my best case scenario. Justice Ginsburg lives for another 10 years, right? Thomas decides it's time, and we have a Democratic president. And if Ginsburg decides it's just time to retire, that president potentially can have 2 appointments. That could change the structure of the court. But the other thing I feel about this court, I mean, it's not about every issue, but I think there are some issues on which the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the court is named after that person, right? The Warren Court, for example, very famous, Republican, appointed by a Republican president, who ended up doing some amazing things that were very progressive on the court. Justice Roberts has the potential to be the swing vote on certain issues, not everyone. I think he will be the swing vote if they try to overturn Roe v. Wade. I hope he'll be the swing vote when this AG challenge to the Affordable Care Act comes to the bench, because he saved it first time around. That doesn't mean that he's going to be with us on many issues, but I think there are a couple or three that we can expect that he will not want to go down in history as the judge who took away health care from millions of Americans, or took away a woman's right to choose. I just don't see it. That's the judgment that history will make. So I'm not entirely pessimistic, but we got to make sure that the notorious RBG lives a long life. So, you know, yes, ma'am.
If Clarence Thomas decides to resign before the election, can we hold like they did?
No, because we don't control the Senate.
Oh.
And the Mitch McConnell, or I think he's now called Moscow Mitch, boy does he hate it when you call him that, right? It's close to home. And that name was really stuck, actually. The one that they came up with one for Lindsey Graham, which I didn't think was particularly good. They called him, I think, Leningrad Lindsey.
Yeah.
I think so. So that didn't stick, but Moscow Mitch does. So he's the guy that decided, because the election was, I think, 11 months away when there was a vacancy, that he was going to hold President Obama's Supreme Court nominee until the next election. And that's how come we ended up with Kavanaugh and Gorsuch. And, I mean, both of them, I think, were unqualified beyond belief.
Is there anything we can do or that they could do?
No, really, because the way the Senate works is so much different than the House, you know. A simple majority is all you need to get a House bill passed, 218 members. And every now and again, you actually get some Republicans who join Democrats on those bills. But now we have a significant majority in the House. That's not a problem. But over in the Senate, the filibuster still remains for Supreme Court justices, and the leader of the Senate decides, as the Speaker does on the House side, what comes to the floor and when. So that's what McConnell did when he just blocked the Garland nomination from President Obama and refused to hear this very qualified man. I mean, I think the president at the time thought if he was able to nominate someone who was considered to be a centrist, kind of like Kennedy was back and forth in the dissenting vote or the deciding vote, that the Senate would go along, but they didn't. And I think if someone, well, I think if, God, I hate to even say it, if Ruth Bader Ginsburg has to leave the Supreme Court, you'll put that on a fast track in the Senate, right? Between now and next November, and they will have enough. Then they'll have 6 justices that are really pretty far to the right. So that's why I say, do not die, please, please, please. We love you. We'll give you what, if you need organs.
I think it's time to get over to the wine bar and the cheese and the sodas and stuff like that, and you can talk one-on-one.
Let me just finish with one last thing. I'm going to leave you a flyer. We have a flyer that we produce every month for our public events, and I'll just leave a whole bunch of them here so you can take away. What these flyers show you are what we think are some of the most significant accomplishments since the Congresswoman has been in office since January. I've talked a little bit about the constituent services piece, but this will show you all the bills that she has voted for, the bills she's introduced, the bills she's co-sponsored. I'll just leave these here for everyone to take a look at. But I do want to say a couple of things of importance about positions. You can introduce bills, you can co-sponsor bills, and she's on the Appropriations Committee, which is huge. Her seniority from being in Congress three times before got her a position on the Appropriations Committee, the only Arizona member of the House to be on appropriations, and it's huge. So she's very carefully managing what she requests from the approps process, and we're getting a lot of things that are good for Southern Arizona and the state. But on some other issues, I think it's important for you to know where she takes her position. She came out for impeachment about 2 months ago, and people say, well, how does something like that happen? Why did she make that decision? She came into the office one morning and said, I'm going for it, it's time. And then she went to the floor to deliver what is called a 1-minute speech, where she declared her support for impeachment. And this was before the hearing, Mueller hearing, which was, I think, an appropriate time to do that. And then on immigration and the border, she's totally opposed to the wall, done everything she can in the Appropriations Committee position to block what the president's trying to do. And we already see one military installation in Arizona is harmed by the president's decision to take money from the military to build this damn wall. What Ann calls it is ego project. It's really what it is, right? He said he'd build it, you gotta build it. And so she's really opposed to that. And we've taken on the immigration issue generally. She's very supportive of certainly more humane treatment. It would be hard not to be supportive of that. She spent a lot of time with the shelters in Tucson, talking to refugees coming in from El Salvador and Guatemala, Honduras, about why they came. And let me just leave you with this story, because I think it really is compelling, and all of us should remember this man and his daughter. When we went to Casa Alitas, which at that time was just a small group home, it housed about maybe 15 people. Then they moved to the monastery and got a lot more, and now they're in a different facility. But anyway, we're there, and we asked if we could speak to one of the refugees who had come through. And so a gentleman, a very small man in his 30s, I guess, late 30s, told us his story. His daughter and he walked and hitchhiked whatever way they could get from Honduras to Tucson, to the border, I should say. It was horrible. Days without food, blisters on their feet, dehydration, all that you would expect from that long journey. So the congresswoman said to him, why did you decide to leave? He said, because the gangs, came to my work and they said, if you don't give us half your paycheck, your family will be killed. Well, you see, that's why people are coming. Things like that. It's not because they want to endure a 3,000-mile walk. So the last part of the story is even more poignant. His 11-year-old daughter and he came, and we said to him, so do you have, where's the mom? Where's this young woman's mom? She's back there. She was 5 months pregnant when he decided to leave because of the threat to his family. She's still there. So this is the real human story about what this administration has done. And in particular, a guy who I call the arch-villain, Stephen Miller, the immigration specialist, if you will, in the White House. What they have done to people seeking refuge in a country that always welcomed refugees. Perhaps no more compelling reason to have a new president than that. So anyway, thank you for your time. And